Hello, I'm Mrs. Walker. Welcome to Forth Valley and West Lothian RIC Supported Study Resources for Higher Classical Studies, Classical Society. Today we will be focusing on higher study skills. Today's lesson will allow you to be supported in your study skills for higher classical studies through tuition and the use of exemplar answers. There will also be example questions for you to attempt during the lesson. You will be able to apply and evidence your understanding of skills by the completion of example questions contained within our lesson today. Throughout today's lesson, in the bottom right-hand corner, you will see various symbols which indicate what you should be doing. The symbols we will be using today are read, write and copy, pause video to complete the task, and correct your work. You will see here the marks allocation for Higher Classical Society. There is a total available of 50 marks. In Section 1, Life in Classical Greece, you can gain 30 marks. And Section 2, Life in the Roman World, you can gain 20 marks. Within the Classical Society component of the higher course, you will complete various question types. You will be looking at comparison questions, which are worth 10 marks. Evaluate the usefulness questions, worth 8. How fully questions are also worth 8 marks. To what extent questions are worth 12 marks. Likewise, analyse and issue questions are also worth 12 marks. Let's get started. First, we will be looking at comparison question structure. Within higher classical studies, your comparison question is worth a maximum of 10 marks. This question type requires you to use your own knowledge, not only to make a comparison with the modern world, but also to come to a judgment about the area you are discussing. Your answer must use both the source and your own knowledge. You should quote directly from the source and then explain this point in your own words. After this, you must then explain your recalled knowledge to show a mixture of similarities and differences. Once again, it is important that you are providing both similarities and differences in your response. So, 4 comparison paragraphs and a conclusion will equate to a full answer. Let's now look at how to structure a comparison question. You will be provided with a source such as the one below. It reads, in the UK, every eligible person over the age of 18 who has registered with the Electoral Commission and is a resident of the UK is allowed to vote. Voters make their choice by placing an X on the polling card for the candidate they feel best represents their values. However, many people in the UK fail to cast their votes and might claim that they have no interest in politics. Polling stations are set up all over the country to allow people to cast their vote in elections. Now, I will now show you how to use this source information above to construct your own answer. You will see that I have highlighted 4 different areas of the source which I will be using to make a comparison between ancient society and the modern world. I would suggest that you ensure that you have highlighters or another means of highlighting information in any timed responses you are completing. You will see here An exemplar comparison question which would gain a candidate full marks. Please notice as we work through this the parts of the question which are boldened and in italics. You can use these to start your sentences and paragraphs and link responses. The source tells us every person over the age of 18 who is registered with the Electoral Commission and is a resident of the UK is eligible to vote, which means that they can play a part in the political system and have a say in the running of the country. This would gain 1 mark. This is similar to the classical world, as all citizens who had to be over the age of 18 had the opportunity to participate in the running of the city. This shows that citizens were given the chance to participate in politics. This would gain you a 2nd mark. The source tells us that, quote, voters make their choice by placing an X on the polling card for the candidate they feel best represents their values. This means that their vote is clear, can be counted and carried out privately. 1 mark. This is different to the classical world, where voting was done by a show of hands. This could be difficult to count and may have been open to abuse. Voting was public, which could sway people's choice. The source tells us that, quote, many people in the UK fail to cast their votes and claim that they have no interest in politics. This means that not everyone participates, and voter turnout can be extremely low, which leads to people feeling ignored and disengaged. This is different to the classical world, as citizens felt proud and patriotic as a result of being involved in the political system. They were keen to play their part. The source tells us that, quote, polling stations are set up all over the country, which means that those who are eligible to vote can do so easily, usually within walking distance of their home. This is different to the classical world, where some people were unable to attend votes as they took place in Athens at dawn. Farmers found it hard to find the time to attend all votes. Therefore, we can conclude that democracy in the classical world was similar to the modern world, as people were given the opportunity to participate in the political system if they met certain requirements. We can also say that people's attitudes to voting are different, as the Athenian citizens were proud to take part, whereas nowadays people often choose not to participate. Now you will see in your conclusion paragraph here that I have drawn on information contained in our 4 comparison paragraphs. There is no new information inserted into the conclusion. You should always make sure that your conclusion is based around what you have already discussed in the previous paragraphs. Here is a comparison question for you to attempt, which looks at the Scottish legal system in the 21st century and then compares it with the legal system in classical Athens. Compare this description of the modern legal system in Scotland with the legal system in classical Athens for 10 marks. Refer to source D and your own knowledge, making an overall conclusion about similarities and differences. When you have completed your response, you will find an exemplar answer on the next slide. Here is an exemplar answer which would gain a candidate full marks. You might have answered slightly different things within your response. Notice that I've highlighted up areas from the source which I have used to construct my response. The source tells us, quote, cases in the High Court are held before a judge and a jury. which means that the jury provides a verdict with which the judge will make a final decision, having listened to the case in entirety. This is similar to classical Athens, as a jury consisting of 201 to 501, depending on the complexity of the case, would listen to the evidence. A variance with today is that an Athenian jury also acted as judge. The source tells us that, quote, at the trial, the prosecution and the defence make speeches, produce evidence and call witnesses. This means that there are lawyers who act on behalf of the two sides to try and prove the other side's client wrong or guilty. This is different to the classical world where the plaintiff and defendant presented their own cases. No lawyers as we know them existed. The source tells us that, quote, the members of the jury discuss the case in private, which can last several days, then return to the courts to announce their verdict. This means that after hearing all evidence, the jury have a relatively unlimited amount of time to deliberate privately over the case and its evidence before coming to a verdict. This is different to the classical world, as the speeches and pleas were limited in time according to its seriousness and the amount of money involved. The jury shouted out their opinions publicly as evidence was given and would cast their vote by placing their stone into one of two urns set up in court. The source tells us that, quote, a jury consisted of 15 adults chosen at random, which means that both men and women aged over 18 up to the age of 75 can be called to serve on a jury today. This is different from classical Athens, where only male citizens aged over 30 were eligible to serve on a jury. Women's, metics and slaves were excluded as they were not afforded citizen status. Therefore, we can conclude that the legal system in classical Athens was different to the modern world, as there were no judges presiding, no representing lawyers, and no privacy in decision-making. Age, gender, and status influenced eligibility to serve as a juror. We can also say that in Athens, a majority decision resulted in a verdict and sentence, whereas in the Scottish legal system, the views of the 15 jurors are considered, but ultimately the final verdict lies with the judge presiding over the case. We will now move on to the evaluate the usefulness question structure, which is worth a maximum of 8 marks. Now, this type of question is asking you to do exactly what it says. You are going to be evaluating how useful a source is for providing information about a given issue within the classical world. Now, to allow you to complete your evaluate the usefulness question successfully, you will be using the 5 W's. Your 5 W's for evaluate the usefulness questions. What not, who, when, and why. To successfully complete your evaluate the usefulness question, you will be discussing, firstly, what the source says, which helps answer the question and makes the source useful. Then, what the source does not say that would have made it more useful. You will comment on who wrote the source. Why are they useful in giving us useful information about the question? You'll look at when the source was written. Was it during the time period indicated in the question? What is going on at the time that makes the source quite useful to us? And then you will look at why the source has been written. What was the purpose of the source? And can its purpose impact its usefulness? You will see here the maximum mark allocations for the various components of an evaluate the usefulness question. Up to 2 marks can be gained for identifying what the source tells us about the given issue. Up to 4 marks can be gained for identifying what the source fails to tell us. At this point, you will be employing your own knowledge recall. And your final 2 marks can be gained for looking at the who, when, and why of the source. Below, you will see a structure which will ensure you success when answering and evaluate the usefulness style question. Another benefit is that it will keep you on track and prevent you from deviating away from the question. Source A is fairly useful for describing or as evidence of. This is always a good introductory sentence to put when answering and evaluate the usefulness question. The source states that, and this means, for 1 mark. The source also states that, this means, for your 2nd mark. Then you are going to move on to what the source does not tell us, for your 4 mark maximum. However, the source is less useful for telling us about, as it fails to mention. The source is less useful for telling us about, as it fails to mention. And you repeat this structure twice more. Now for your final 2 marks. The source was written by, this is useful because, however, it limits the usefulness as. The source was written in the century BC or AD. This is useful as, however, it limits the usefulness because. The source is a, and then you might choose to insert a comic play, tragic play, historic account, poem, satirical writing, letter, whatever at this point. This is useful because, however, it limits the usefulness because or as. For this final section, you can gain a maximum of 2 marks. I am now going to show you and evaluate the usefulness exemplar, which will aid and support you with completing your own shortly. Using the source, you are being asked to evaluate the usefulness of the source for describing the type of work a woman was expected to carry out in an Athenian household in the 5th century BC for 8 marks. Here is the response to the question, which adheres to the aforementioned structure and would achieve full marks. Source A is reasonably useful as evidence of the type of work a woman was expected to carry out in an Athenian household in the 5th century BC. The source states, quote, "My dear wife, it will be your duty to remain indoors and send out those of the household who work outside and supervise those who work inside." This means that though a woman was ultimately controlled by her husband, she had an element of control by holding responsibility for controlling the slaves and allotting them work tasks within the home each day. The source also states, quote, "See that all members of the household who fall ill are cared for." This means that another type of work an Athenian woman was expected to do was to serve as nurse and carer to the entire household, including the slaves. The source states that even though she may not have wanted to, nursing the sick was her duty and an expectation. However, the source is less reliable for telling us about other roles and work that was expected of a 5th century BC Athenian woman, as it fails to mention that the role of cook would have fallen to the woman of the house rather than the slaves. The source is less useful for telling us about the work that was expected of a 5th century BC Athenian woman, as a woman's main job was to produce a strong male heir. Once born, children became the property of the husband. The source omits to tell us about the work that was expected of a 5th century BC Athenian woman, as it fails to mention that women were expected to teach their female offspring how to run a household and care for children and the sick. And finally, the source is less useful for telling us about the work expected of a 5th century BC Athenian woman, as it fails to mention that women were expected to work at the loom making cloth. This was a place where women could receive female visitors. The source was written by an Athenian man, Xenophon, which is useful as it informs us of the role of a woman within an Athenian home. However, it limits the usefulness as it was written about a woman from a male perspective. The source was written in the 5th century BC, making it a primary source. This is useful as it describes events as they occurred. However, it is limited as it fails to mention many aspects of the type of work a woman was expected to carry out in an Athenian household in the 5th century BC. The source is an extract from a book written about the correct way to run a household, which is useful because we can gauge the expectations of a 5th century BC Athenian woman. Its use is limited, however, because we are only told about the work expectations of women and not how they felt about their role. Here is an evaluate the usefulness question for you to try. Read the source written by historian Diodorus Siculus during the 1st century BC regarding the treatment of slaves in the Spanish silver mines, and then evaluate the usefulness of the source for telling us about the treatment of slaves during the 1st century BC. You can use information about the origin of the source, content of the source, and what you know about the issue to make a judgment about the usefulness of the source overall for 8 marks. You will see an accurate response to this when you have completed your own work. Here is an accurate response to the question. Your own response might vary slightly from this. Source B is fairly useful for describing the treatment of slaves during the 1st century BC. The source states, quote, "Many die because of the excessive maltreatment they suffer." This means that slaves' lives were not valued and would often be worked so hard they would die, showing the disregard for the meaning of a slave's life and how their treatment could often lead to death. The source also states, quote, "Forced by the whiplashes of the overseers to endure the most dreadful treatment of hardships," which shows that slaves were subject to punishments to get them to work, telling us slaves were often treated with violent and harmful punishments in the 1st century BC, such as whipping and other harsh treatments. However, the source is less useful for telling us about the treatment of female slaves during the 1st century BC, as it fails to mention how female slaves were often treated worse than male slaves, as men were deemed more valuable in the ancient world, meaning that women would typically experience worse treatment in their life as a slave compared to a male slave. The source is also less useful telling us about the slave freedom, as it fails to mention how slaves in ancient Rome were more likely to gain their freedom than in ancient Athens. Slaves could gain their freedom either informally or formally by various methods performed by their master, which meant they were free and could live their life free of any unfair treatment. The source is less useful for telling us about the treatment of an emperor's slaves, as it fails to mention how the slave of an emperor would often hold a high status in society despite being a slave. This meant that they would be allowed to carry out clerical jobs and would be treated well. They also had a higher chance of being granted freedom and could live a life of comfort and hope. Finally, the source is less useful for telling us how a slave's treatment depended on their master's attitude, as it fails to mention how some slave masters would build good relations with their slaves and treat them fairly, whereas some masters viewed their slaves as property and did not value building any sort of relationship with them. Such slaves would be at the mercy of their master and be treated unfairly, as previously highlighted. The source was written by Diodorus Siculus, an historian at the time who would have been educated on the ancient world and knowledgeable about slavery. However, its usefulness is limited as Diodorus himself may have owned slaves, conveying bias in his writing due to this situation. The source was written in 1st century BC, making it useful, as the writer would likely have had first-hand experience of slavery and seeing how slaves were treated. However, the usefulness of this is limited due to extract being written in the 1st century BC, which does not take into account any changes or developments that progressed in the treatment of slaves in the ancient world after the 1st century BC. We are now going to look at the how fully question structure, which is worth a maximum of 8 marks. In this question type, you are being asked to make an overall judgment about how fully the source explains the topic in question. To do this, you must use your own recalled knowledge. You will achieve 1 mark for each valid point you make and explain from the sources, or a mark for each valid point of recalled knowledge. Each point from the source must be developed or interpreted. You will not gain any marks in a how fully question for simply quoting, paraphrasing, or copying from the source. Below you will see a how fully structure which you can use to answer this type of question. How fully questions will have 3 sources for you to use, and often you will be asked to use at least 2 of the sources. However, in this example here, I have chosen to use sources A, B, and C. Source A shows, which tells us about, as, will gain you 1 mark. By showing, source A reveals, about, for your 2nd mark. Now you will repeat this twice more to gain your first 6 marks of the 8. However, the source fails to tell us about, and you will insert your topic here. The source also fails to explain or mention, and then insert something there. You will gain 2 marks for this final paragraph. We are now going to look at a how fully question and an exemplar paragraph. How fully do sources A, B, and C explain the methods used by Athens to organise the law courts? Use at least 2 of the sources and your own knowledge. Source A, below, is a water clock. Here is a way you would gain 2 marks for using the image of a water clock. The sources explain the methods used by Athens to organise the law courts to an extent. It's always good to have an introductory sentence to your how fully answer. Source A shows a water clock which tells us the way that speeches were timed during a court hearing in ancient Athens for 1 mark. You have made and explained your point here through applying your knowledge of what a water clock was used for. By showing how speeches were timed, Source A reveals that the water clock could be used by professional speechwriters to time their speeches effectively. This gave those who could afford to hire them an unfair advantage in court for a 2nd mark. Now, this part of your paragraph shows that you have developed or interpreted the source using your own knowledge. Here is a how fully question for you to try. Source A is a water clock. Source B is written by a modern writer, and source C was written by a Greek writer. How fully do sources A, B, and C explain the methods used by Athens to organise the law courts? Use at least 2 of the sources and your own knowledge for 8 marks. There will be a full response when you have completed your own. The response below has used both the sources and recalled knowledge effectively to give a full and complete how fully style question response. The sources explain the methods used by Athens to organise the law courts to an extent. Source A shows a water clock which tells us about the organisation of law courts in ancient Athens, as a water clock was used to time speeches in the courtroom. By showing the water clock, Source A reveals that these machines were used to people's advantages in court to time speeches to best effect. Source B states, quote, "This system and the size of the juries was designed to prevent corruption," meaning that the system was put in place because corruption was prominent in ancient Athenian courts. It reveals that corruption was commonplace as the jury could be easily swayed by techniques employed to gain the jurors' sympathy and approval. Source C states, quote, "The bronze one has a pierced attachment through which only one ballot can pass, so that one man cannot cast two votes," which means that measures were put in place to try and discourage corruption in law courts. By explaining how the votes were carried out, the source reveals that the system tried to battle corruption by enforcing a system which would reveal if someone attempted to cast more than one vote. However, the source fails to mention that the jury could easily be swayed by the defendant arranging for one or more speakers to plead for him, and if these speakers were good and effective, the jury would applaud them and look more kindly on the defendant's case. The sources also failed to mention that the jurors could shout out their opinions during the trial and could even be abusive. We will now move on to the "to what extent" question structure, which is worth 12 marks. In a "to what extent" question, you will comment on 4 different areas connected to the question you are answering, and you will do this by using your own knowledge recall. You should use the following structure for each area and mini paragraph that you are writing. You will write down one piece of knowledge about the area for your first mark. You will then indicate what this knowledge shows about the area for a second mark. And then for a third mark in each paragraph, you will provide a counterpoint or alternative viewpoint about the knowledge you have selected. Here are 4 areas you might choose to use when answering "to what extent could the Roman voting system be called democratic?" You might choose to consider, firstly, who was allowed to vote. Now, we will be using this as our exemplar paragraph. You might also choose to consider whether or not every vote was equal, where people had to go to vote, and for your 4th paragraph, the issue of corruption and bribery. Now remember, in a "to what extent" question, you are trying to reach a decision about the extent of your issue. In this case, to what extent could the Roman voting system be construed and called democratic? So here is an exemplar paragraph to a "to what extent" question, which would achieve 3 marks. The Roman voting system could be called democratic to an extent. As always, your introduction starter sentence should always be used. The structure of the Roman voting system meant that most adult male citizens were eligible to vote. Despite the Roman voting assemblies being organised by wealth, lower-class male citizens were also afforded the right to vote and participate in political matters, indicating that the system was democratic. However, the level of democracy within the Roman voting system could be questioned, as foreigners who had gained citizenship through imperial expansion and financial contribution to the empire were denied the opportunity to vote due to not being born a Roman citizen. You have effectively employed the 3-point structure for this paragraph and have achieved 3 marks. Here is a question for you to try. To what extent can the Roman voting system be called democratic? There will be a full answer to look over when you have completed your own response. Here is a full response to the question. Your response might look slightly different to this. One part of the Roman voting system was the Comitia Centuriata. This was the main assembly and dealt with big and impactful issues such as war. It was one of the 3 voting assemblies in the Roman constitution and was usually run by praetors. However, even though all citizens could attend, praetors were usually very wealthy people. This makes the Roman voting system less democratic, as poorer people may not have had the chance to call things that they felt passionate about in comparison. Within the voting system, all Roman citizens were allowed to vote. This meant that any voting processes that needed to be made on an issue could be participated in by all citizens regardless of social class. However, you could not be a citizen if you were a woman, meaning only certain groups of people living in Rome could gain citizenship, which would allow them to vote, questioning the democracy of the Roman voting system. One aspect of the Roman voting system was the number of people who were required to take part in a vote. In Rome, there was no minimum number of people required to vote for it to be classed as legitimate, allowing less pressure to be put on citizens to attend. However, this could also mean that secret votes could happen that not everyone would have known about, but which could have had impact, as a vote partaken by 4 people could have the exact same outcome as a vote taken by 4,000 people. Within the Roman voting system, votes could be easily manipulated. Within Rome, there was a major split between the rich and poor citizens. Patricians would try and bribe plebeians to vote for their views. This meant that many citizens would not vote fairly, making the Roman voting system less democratic. However, plebeians did not have to succumb to the bribery of patricians and could have voiced their own opinions. The final question type in our higher classical studies study skills is the analyze an issue question, which is worth a maximum of 12 marks. Now, the following is a straightforward structure which you can follow and apply when 3 different aspects are used for this type of question. Each full and complete paragraph you complete will gain you 4 marks. So for each paragraph, you must do the following. You should state your point. You should then expand your point and develop it further. Now, these 2 components will be knowledge recall. Then, using your knowledge of the area, you will analyze what you have written, and then you will provide a counterpoint or counter argument. Now, it's important that you use quantitative language. For example, some Greeks believe, or a few Romans thought this was the case, or many women in the ancient world suffered. Now, in analysis and evaluation, you're looking at cause and effect. So what happened and what was the effect? You're looking at contrasts and comparisons. Some people lived like, whereas others lived like. And then also you're looking at different interpretations. For example, some believed that slaves were tools, whereas others thought they should be treated like humans. Here is an exemplar paragraph for an analyze an issue question for higher classical studies. Analyze the ways in which an Athenian man could be a responsible citizen for 12 marks. The democratic government of Athens allowed male citizens to be responsible members of society by giving them the opportunity to participate directly in the government of their city. You've made your knowledge point for 1 mark. From the age of 18, all males had the right to participate in the assembly, with the right to both speak and vote. This means that any male could, in theory, voice his opinions on the issues that mattered to him. You have taken your knowledge and you have expanded this for a 2nd mark. However, some citizens may have felt that this opportunity did not exist in practice because the assembly tended to be highly influenced by aristocratic speakers, perhaps with their own agendas. Whether or not this is true, it cannot be disputed that the Athenian citizen did have the right to make himself heard if he so wished. So you have taken your original point, you have expanded it, and you have now also analysed it for your 3rd mark. And then finally, this is in direct opposition to the position women and slaves found themselves in, where they were not afforded the luxury of having a say in politics and so could never be deemed a responsible citizen in a political setting. So once again, you've taken your initial point of knowledge, you have expanded it, you have analysed it, and you have then, for your 4th mark, provided a counterpoint. This will gain you 4 marks for this paragraph. Now you should pause and attempt the question below. Analyse the relationship between Athens and other states during the 5th century BC for 12 marks. Remember to refer to the structure guide and the exemplar paragraph to help you. Here is a partial response to your Analyse an issue question. When the cities of Ionia first revolt against the Persians, they ask for help from the Greek mainland. While Sparta refuses to get involved, Athens sends 20 ships, a sizable portion of its fleet at that time, to help. This perhaps shows that Athens was a state willing to help its neighbours when they were in need. However, the later developments of the Delian League and subsequent imperial rule by Athens perhaps suggest that the Athenians may have offered help only because they saw an opportunity for these states to provide support to Athens in the future, or indeed because these Ionian cities provided a buffer zone between the Persian Empire and mainland Greece. Whatever the reason for their involvement, it does show that the Athenians perhaps showed more foresight than the Spartans, who presumably did not feel the need to create friendly allies from elsewhere in Greece through offering help or a need to protect the buffer zone between them and the Persian Empire. Congratulations on completing the skills lesson for Higher Classical Studies, Classical Society. Today's lesson has provided you with an overview of the different question types and skills required for Higher Classical Studies, Classical Society. Please use this presentation as required to assist you with any study you might be undertaking. Remember to access SQA resources, workbooks, and of course your own teacher for any further study advice and support. Good luck!